Yep, it's popped up.
Okay, welcome to another IWA webinar. We're very grateful to have Cristina and Rhys, who are speaking to us about consumption, and we know that consumption is really important when it comes to managing non-revenue water and leakage. So we're now going to hand over to Cristina and Rhys, who will give us a good overview of consumption and especially what happens when we get some shocks in consumption. So Cristina, Rhys, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. So as Michael said, today we're talking about quantifying consumption and how that can improve estimates of non-revenue water and the water balance, and in particular talking about the shock events that we've recently worked to quantify. So we'll start off by giving a little introduction to Artesia. We're quite a small company, so a lot of people won't know us. We're a consultancy of about 25 people located in Yate, near Bristol, in the UK. And our core focus is a clean water demand focused consultancy, mostly helping the UK water industry assess problems around water consumption, leakage, and quantifying consumption and various aspects of the water balance. And we particularly have a focus on combining data science and water industry expertise. And who are we personally? I'm Rhys Durham, water demand consultant. I've been at Artesia for just over a year and working in this area for about 7 years. And I'm particularly focused on the water balance, quantifying consumption, and leakage.
And I am Cristina Munilla. I'm a senior data scientist at Artesia. Been working for Artesia 8 years now, and I'm mostly focused on modeling. That's my field of expertise. So looking forward to talking a little bit about the project today. That's it.
And then what do we do? A little bit more detail on the work in Artesia. So a lot of our work, as we've said, is focused on this area in terms of quantifying consumption, and that works to help companies with the water balance and to improve their estimates of leakage. And that obviously the related areas for a regulatory perspective, helping companies with their regulatory reporting, which informs kind of performance targets and sort of things. And we also have a little bit more operational elements in there around forecasting, developing strategies for demand reduction, helping with water efficiency programs, things like that, as well as understanding leakage. And as well as consumption, we also work across, as I said, those leakage, asset management, network monitoring, affects other elements of the water balance that aren't due to customer consumption, like water used by the utility and distribution input and elements like that, and also metering, which kind of cuts across these areas. Okay, so why is consumption very important for non-revenue water? And it basically amounts to the water balance being so highly dependent on consumption. So you can see here, this is the typical IWA water balance, and you can see that sort of in the top left, we have more confident estimates going over to the bottom right with less confident. So system input volume, the total water that goes into supply, is usually the most confident estimate in the water balance. Generally, all of the sources will be metered, there'll be high resolution data available, and generally this will be where the most sophisticated metering will be located. And then you have authorized consumption, particularly billed consumption, which is also directly measured, and you can get a relatively good understanding of that. There are some issues in terms of resolution, with the reads being collected infrequently, sometimes only every 6 months or every year. And then we have the unmetered consumption, which is a little less accurate, but there are still kind of monitors and small-scale programs that you can use to estimate quite well when you consider kind of customer demographics and things like that. But what's more difficult is water losses. and that covers apparent losses and real losses. And there often needs to be a variety of different estimation approaches, and estimating each of those individual components can be quite difficult. So as a result, the best way of calculating most of these components is take your system input volume and subtract the water that you can account from customer consumption. And that's why understanding that is really important, because otherwise you can't understand leakage. So in the UK, as I've hinted at there, in the UK, there's quite a significant focus on leakage rather than some of the other aspects of non-revenue water and unaccounted for water. And that's basically because of the regulatory environment and the history in the UK. So historically, particularly over the last, say, 20 years or so, the focus has really been on providing value for money for customers. So those physical losses have kind of been more of a focus than those other sources. Another element is that we use the maximum likelihood estimation method. So we combine a bottom-up and top-down water balance to get the most accurate possible estimate. And we do this partially because there's been historically low levels of metering, which is improving, meter penetration is increasing. But effectively, we do that because of that uncertainty on consumption in the top-down water balance. And this gives a little insight into regulation and why consumption is particularly important. So water companies in England and Wales are fully privatised. And obviously that's resulted in a greater level of investment than there was before privatisation. But it also means that quite sophisticated regulation is needed to make sure that companies' priorities are aligned to those of customers and broader society. Water companies are regulated by Ofwat, who are the regulator, and they set targets with financial incentives is the fundamental way that things are managed. So the targets cover a lot of areas, but particularly relevant to this is leakage and customer consumption, which is quantified by per capita consumption. And understanding consumption is very important for both of those targets. And from 2025, customers will also have an incentive to reduce non-household and business customer use. So that will be an added incentive and mean quantifying that will also become more important. Because of these targets are quite significant financially and important to the water companies, there's a lot of complex requirements set out to make sure that companies are compliant and doing things in a consistent and reliable way relative to the importance of this. So leakage in the UK, I won't talk about this in too much detail, but something to really talk about is the trend that you can see there. And you can see that there are particular periods, generally around 5-year periods, which is what the water companies in England and Wales plan over 5 years. And you can see that while there are blips and odd periods where particular events such as weather and things have an impact, you can see that broadly it's primarily dependent on what water companies have done. You can see in the 1990s that leakage really went down and then sort of crept back up, then was brought back down and remained relatively flat for a number of years. And you can see that they've started to deliver reductions now. So leakage is primarily over a long enough time period within the control of water companies. But then consumption has quite a different history in the UK. And a lot of changes in consumption are actually driven by societal changes, government interventions, different communities, weather, and there hasn't really been a systematic change due to water company actions. Part of that is because water companies weren't historically incentivized to reduce consumption. Now they do, and this means that delivering water efficiency programs is new to a lot of these companies, whereas there are some countries with particularly arid conditions where that's more common practice. Government policies are planned to help reduce consumption, but in the short term, most of this is dependent on water companies. But there is obviously a question now, and it's what we look to explore in this project about how in control the water companies are of consumption, and to what extent other events, which we call exogenous events, that are outside of water company control, how significant they are relative to the targets that water companies have.
Okay. Thanks, Rhys, for that. So after this introduction from Rhys, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we did and this project and how shock events were accounted for to understand PCC consumption. So as Rhys mentioned before, of what requires water companies to establish performance commitments for PCC that reflect reductions from historical levels. And these commitments are assessed annually based on a 3-year rolling average. And in this context, modeling PCC becomes quite essential. We could think of using maybe direct estimates from meters, and this can offer very valuable insights. But many households in the UK are still a meter, and then we need to account for the fact that meters might be read at different frequencies, and this would make it a little bit more difficult to understand what's happening at a higher resolution, and higher resolution meaning, for instance, on a daily basis, weekly basis, etc. And this is why modeling becomes quite necessary to understand, to have a complete understanding of water usage patterns across both meter and unmeter households. But the good thing is that in general, we have a very good understanding of the drivers of consumption. They tend to be quite consistent on a daily basis and seasonal variations as well. They tend to be driven, these consumption patterns tend to be driven by also calendar events, which are very well understood in general. And we do have then the responses to weather conditions. To give you an example of this, you are seeing plot here on this slide. This is a spectrogram of a DMA containing several thousands of households and maybe a few non-household properties. Although we are not specifically talking about non-households, for the sake of the visualization and the explanation, this is a good plot. So this is a spectrogram, and I'm going to give a brief explanation of what you are seeing here for those of you who might not be familiar with this type of visualization. On the x-axis, what you have, it's the days of the year. In this case, we are going from March 2017 up to February or up to December 2019, so right before the start of the pandemic. And on the y-axis, you have the time of the day in a 24-hour. Now, the colors of the plot indicate the liters per property per hour, so darker values indicate lower consumption, brighter values indicate higher consumption. Now, here's where we can see that those consistent patterns from during night, what you have from 12 up till 6 in the morning, we have very dark values. This is mostly when people are sleeping, so therefore water consumption tends to be at its lowest. As the morning arises, we have the morning peak consumption, people waking up, going to work, taking showers, and that continues throughout the morning with a small decrease in the afternoon, as you can see here, with mainly darker colors. And then again, we have the evening peak, where we have those brighter colors again. So there you go. These are the daily patterns, but we can also see the effect of calendar events. For instance, the difference between weekends and weekdays are very clearly observed here. Let's have a look. Can you see my arrow, by the way, Rhys? Yep.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So we have these vertical lines here, which this is what is showing is the difference between weekends and weekdays, where the morning peak during the weekends tends to be delayed compared to the weekdays. We can also see other calendar events. For instance, this here, it's Christmas, and then we have, we can also see the seasonal variations. This is a 3-year plot. So we have 2017, 18, and 19. You can see as we get to the summer months, the evening peak is extended in time. And also we have brighter colors with suggesting a higher consumption. This can be observed across all years, but for instance, in 2018, which was particularly hot and dry in the UK, we have really, really high, significantly higher consumption compared to the other two adjacent years. So as we can see, this is a very consistent picture, very well understood. What happened is in the 23rd of March in 2020, the UK entered into lockdown, and this completely changed the picture of how water was consumed. This is the same spectrogram we saw before, but just showing a couple of years from January 2019 up to the end of 2020. And you can observe here is that as soon as we entered the lockdown, those very consistent patterns that we used to see before are completely disrupted. And we can also kind of see that there's a very significant increase in water consumption. So not only change in pattern, but also increase in water consumption. In essence, this triggered a profound transformation in water consumption patterns across the UK. Because this significant increase in PCC became evident, there were raising concerns about its potential effects on those PCC targets. So in July 2020, we began a project to quantify what was the effect of COVID. How we did this was we said, okay, we do understand consumption fairly well. We do have data for this. We will try to build models using household data at high resolution and using variables that are known to be drivers of consumption, but for the using pre-COVID period. That is the normal response that you would expect if COVID hadn't happened. What drivers did we use? As we said, calendar variables, weather variables, and the results of this modeling are, there's an example, that the plot that you are seeing on the screen is an example of the results of that modeling. This is a particular example for a specific company, but we did the same type of analysis for several companies, and all of them show very similar and consistent responses. So what you see on the plot is on the x-axis, we have the days of in 2020 going from the UK onset of the COVID pandemic up to more or less late October 2020. The orange block is what the model predicted should have happened with the absence of COVID. The blue block is actually what actually happened. And therefore, we estimated that this difference between the two blocks would be driven by COVID, mainly. So in general, what we observed during this project was an average increase of 8 to 10% in PHC from March to September, but with variations depending on the specific periods. This difference was in general attributed to people spending more time at home and the heightened sanitation measures. Now, one of the observations we made that was consistent across all the data sets we studied is that there were certain periods of time where the difference was quite high. For instance, this block here. This specific period actually coincided with very hot and dry weather conditions in the UK, and therefore it suggested that this was mainly driven by an increased outdoor water use. So the conclusions were that both indoors but also outdoor consumption increased as a result of COVID. So at this point, this was when we started doing that project was around July 2020. And at that point, the general anticipation was that the pandemic would be under control by September 2020. But as we now know, this expectation was far from reality. So in light of these ongoing impacts, it became evident that water companies would likely miss their PCC targets. And then water companies need to reassess the existing PCC targets due to the changing landscape of water use, influenced by factors such as the COVID-19 pandemic. So in 2023, we started this collaborative project to understand the full picture of the COVID pandemic and other shock events and its impact on PCC targets. But what had happened, we first needed to have an understanding what had happened during this period. So as we know, 2020 was marked by very severe disruptions in daily lives. We had restrictions, lockdowns. 2021, the picture was not as dramatic, let's say, but still life was severely disrupted, although around more or less July of 2021, the UK started to enter an initial return to normality where quite a few of the most relevant restrictions that were in place were lifted. So, things like gatherings, limitations of gatherings were lifted. And I think as well the number of people in venues. So this marks the initial return to normality. And in March 2022, it's when it's what we now call the new normal, which is when most of the restrictions were lifted, if not all, or the most relevant ones. And therefore, what we would expect from 2022 onwards are the changes in life would be the long-lasting effects of COVID. So at this point, we decided to quantify the effects of these shock events following more or less the same approach. Let's try, we have several data sets for these from different companies. Again, this is an example of what you are seeing on the screen, but most of them show similar responses. We decided to model the expected response, so that's the orange line. The blue line is what actually happened. This section of the plot with the white background, it's pre-COVID and indicates that both the model values and the actual values in PCC were very closely aligned. And as soon as we enter into the period affected by COVID, these two lines diverge. Because it's a little bit tricky to see in the plot, what we have done is looking at this from a residuals perspective. So basically the difference between these two lines. And this it's just for visualization purposes. So as we can see here, as soon as we enter the COVID, we have all those restrictions. PCC just significantly increases, and this increase is maintained through the first few months of the pandemic. Then it's reduced a little bit, but in general, it's maintained. As soon as we start phase 7 is what we call that initial return to normality. We see how these residuals gradually start coming back to baseline levels. Baseline level referring to this horizontal red line. Interestingly, this, instead of remaining around these baseline values, which is what we would expect, this trend continued to go down even during as we start the new normal, which is this blue block. So what happened there? So what's the reason for this? We need to understand that at this point, yes, we did have COVID, and the COVID, specifically COVID restrictions were the main driver of that super high increase in consumption. Then we have those long-term COVID effects, mostly related at this point to working from home. So we would expect that one of the long-term effects of COVID is that we would have a higher percentage of people working from home, and this has become sort of this new normal. If you have more people at home, we would have expect an increased baseline on PCC just because people are spending more time at home. But there are more things going on. One of the most relevant one would say it's the cost of living crisis. The cost of living crisis in the UK began to escalate in early 2020, and by late 2023, the situation had strained household budgets, in a sense, making essential goods and services less affordable for many. Now, this could have a two-direction effect. Households might try to cut back on energy bills, and this would have a knock-on effect on water use by reducing it, but also changes in activities like fewer holidays or outdoor activities would mean more people would spend more time at home, increasing that PCC. And we don't really know which one was more dominant or what was the net effect. On top of that, we had very particular weather conditions, especially during 2020, which I've already mentioned, and 2022 was particularly warm, dry. Again, we knew from the previous study that hot weather, in general, we would expect an increase in PCC, but in the previous study, what became apparent is that there was a magnifying effect, and then of that, the weather and the COVID conditions. But that was a very particular summer, because that's when most of the COVID restrictions were in place. Therefore, that relationship, we couldn't tell if this relationship was going to be maintained throughout the rest of the time period. We would expect an increase, though, on PCC. But the situation in 2020 was so dry that England had to declare drought due to prolonged dry weather and below average rainfall. This meant that certain regions implemented temporary use bans, therefore reducing consumption. But many other companies were also had many water-saving campaigns, and that would naturally have an effect on water use by reducing it, hopefully. Now, the magnitude and the scale of this effect, it's not really understood. So all in all, what you see is we not only have COVID, we have several other things going on at the same time, all of them with different directions, and the scale with an unknown scale, meaning that this was quite challenging to understand what was the actual impact specifically of COVID in this case, which is what we were most interested on. So that what did we do? We said, right, okay, so we have this difference in expected PCC. We know that there are several shock events or conditions happening at the same time. We have the weather, we have cost of living crisis, we have the implementation of TAPs, water campaigns. So let's try to explain this difference using those shock events variables. And that's what we did. Now, the selection of the modeling type was mainly driven by our ability to interpret those results. That is, there are many modeling options that might give us better performance or better or more accurate models, if you wish. However, they might not be interpretable. and this was a key component of the decision. Therefore, we went for a simple linear regression model, because at the end of the day, what this gives you is I give the model a set of variables, COVID, shock events, other shock events, and I will get a coefficient for it, and that would give me the influence. Problem with one of the challenges with the linear regression models, well, there are actually a couple of problems. First of all, that it's more interpretable, but it won't be able to capture, for instance, nonlinear relationships or interactions. But most importantly, it doesn't, it really suffers with when we have several variables which occur simultaneously, let's say, or events that happen at the same time. That is the collinearity problem across between variables. This really means that sounds like technical, but what this really means is that because it happens at the same time, the model really is not able to attribute in a very specific way the weights to those variables. So if we have water saving campaigns and temporary use bans at the same time, it says, okay, I see this effect. This effect was, let's say, 10 liters per day, but I don't know if it's 7 because of water saving campaigns and 3 due to temporary use bans, or vice versa. So this is something we had to account for, and we need to, in general, accept that uncertainty. Because this same situation happened with several variables, because all these events happened at the same time, we said, right, okay, I accept that I'm going to have a certain level of uncertainty, but I want to be as sure as possible about the COVID effects, because that was the main interest at this point. So the models were refined in such a way that we could say with a high degree of confidence this was the effect of COVID, but probably it was higher than that. We couldn't say the same for the other variables, because that had like, if I provide more confidence to this variable, that's going to have, we need to accept lesser certainty for the other variables. So this plot shows the results of for one of the companies. What you're seeing here are those residuals we were seeing in previous plots. This is the blue dashed line. Then you have a red dashed line, which is what the model predicted. And then the color areas represent the effect of each one of the variables that were taken into account. So for instance, the blue block here corresponds to the COVID restrictions, saying that the model gave quite a lot of weight during this period to those restrictions as expected. Then we have the orange block, which is percentage of people working from home. This had a consistent weight through the time series. Obviously, there was a reduction from 2021 onwards, but this effect it's maintained and is expected to be maintained in the future, at least short term or medium term. And then the other effect that we accounted for was the cost of living crisis. You could see the effect starts to kick in more or less at the same time that restrictions were lifted, and the peak effect was more or less 2022 at this point. At this point, we also had that very hot and dry weather conditions, and the effect of the temporary use bans and drought awareness of the population are represented here. So all in all, we observed more or less around 1-2% increase during this period in per capita consumption. But when we focus specifically on the effect of COVID, the estimate was around 5%. And remember, this is a very conservative estimate, so we would expect it to be higher. Then this effect varied across different periods of time. In some cases, we were seeing like increases of over 10%. So all in all, the conclusion from this piece of work was the cumulative impact of COVID-19 effects on annual average PCC was material and persistent for AMP7. And these results were consistent across data sets that we evaluated. So those were the main conclusions. I'll pass back to Rhys.
Yeah, so as Christina said, this slide sort of gives a summary of what the main conclusions were in terms of the impact on consumption. So obviously variability in both household and non-household consumption was much greater since 2020 due to the shock events that Christina's mentioned. And particularly COVID-19 led to a large spike in household consumption, which was accompanied by a reduction in non-household consumption, but the net effect was an increase in total demand. And while harder to predict, the cost of living crisis led to a reduction in household consumption. And that's thought to be primarily driven by the affordability of energy bills. However, we have to recognize that that was a short-term issue, and even though energy bills are still somewhat higher, it's nowhere near that peak effect. There's also the persisting impact of COVID-19 and particularly working from home, which has led to a new normal. So there's a concern that while at the end of this 5-year period, consumption might have returned to something fairly normal due to the cost of living and COVID-19, but in the long term, only that increase will persist. And when we also found that there was significant regional variation, even though the same trends were present. So the impact must vary on a range of factors. And then we've also highlighted here a few of the regulatory implications, particularly for sort of the UK audience here. So since 2020, the net aggregate impact of these shock events was greater than the planned PCC reductions that board companies were funded and targeted to deliver. So that really supports the case for some sort of adjustment given that. And because we felt that the scale and causes of these shocks would undermine the incentives for companies to improve in the future if completely unforeseeable events can have larger impacts than their own activities. So as a result of that, we recommended an ex-ante adjustment for the COVID-19, for the PCC target due to COVID-19. So the impact that's going to have on non-revenue water and the water balance is basically the consumption of metered customers should still be fairly well accounted for. However, it does highlight the importance of regular meter reading. But the consumption of unmeasured customers, if those numbers haven't been reviewed in recent years, if you don't have active monitors that keep track of that, then those historic estimates could now be out of date due to the new normal, which I think will be the same across most countries. Night use estimates that have been previously calculated will have the same problems, and they might not be appropriate any longer, so those should be reviewed. And the relative sizes of water balance components will have meaningfully changed, particularly if work from home is still prevalent in your countries, and that's likely to persist going forward. And utilities should consider how recent increases might change their long-term water resource needs. This could be the difference of needing to create a new water source or delivering further non-revenue water reductions than you might have had planned in the next 20 to 50 years. And I think that's everything from us.
Thank you, Cristina. Thank you, Rhys. Really appreciate that. Fascinating. Really enjoyed it. So it's amazing when you've got different factors moving in different directions. So you've got COVID, you've got cost of living, you've got temporary use bans, you've got drought awareness, and you're trying to work out if it's going up and down and what the effect of that. So some really great modelling there. I guess a question to yourself, Cristina and Rhys, what can we do to improve the modelling going forward? Can water companies do something to improve the data that we give companies like yourselves to improve the modelling to understand demand better? What can we do?
Well, I guess
Well,
something
um,
that we were quite reliant on in this project was sort of that individual property level data in terms of individual household monitors and smart meters. So I guess the collection of more of that data would definitely give us a better idea. And if there were more properties like that, we might be able to start looking at kind of different demographic variables that might be driving some differences in change in the level of changes.
yeah,
Okay, and
absolutely.
sorry, go on, Cristina.
Yeah, one of the things that we saw in the first project we worked on back in 2020 was that the effect of COVID in particularly differ significantly depending on the property type, whether that was flat, terrace houses, detached houses. That's something that we definitely observed.
And would that be the reason why the variation across the country differed? Because there are some parts of the country where you've got more flats and other parts of the country where you've got bigger houses. I guess, is that one of the reasons why we may see a geographical variation?
I would say so. That would be one of the reasons. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think
And
for the
final question.
cost of living,
Sorry.
sorry, I think for the cost of living as well, we also saw that to some extent in terms of it appeared that the cost of living impact somewhat varied based on uh, the level of wealth in those areas. So sort of wealthier rural areas were likely to see larger impacts, and then poorer urban areas seemed more likely to see a larger impact. So yeah, I think that's a factor as well. But we didn't have enough data points to really quantify that.
Okay. And then one final question before we finish then is, what do you think the role of smart meters will be going forward in helping us understand consumption and helping us understand perhaps why consumption is different in different areas?
Well, I think that will give you the ability to monitor things in closer to real time. And obviously, for projects like this, we'd be able to look at things in more detail. But it will also give you an indication of not necessarily the level of detail we went to here, but you'll be able to see trends in consumption on a much more granular level on, based on your own analysis, maybe weekly or monthly, which at the moment might not come through until kind of 6 monthly annual meter reads.
Okay, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you for your time again today. Cristina, could you just do one thing for us? Could you just stop the recording?
Where?
Okay,
Stop
let's
share or
stop share. No, I think, wait a minute, maybe, I'll tell you what. I can probably do it. Yes, I think I found a way.